Iranian officials are calling the U.S. seizure of a Venezuelan oil tanker an act of state-sponsored piracy. According to Iranian and regional media outlets, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Ismail Baghai issued a sharp condemnation of Washington's action. U.S. authorities seized the tanker near Venezuela, according to multiple reports. The move marks an escalation in President Trump's pressure campaign against Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Since the first Trump administration imposed oil sanctions on Venezuela in 2017, Maduro's government has relied on tankers to move crude into global supply chains despite American restrictions. Iran's spokesperson framed the seizure as illegal and called on other countries to respond. According to Mehr news agency, Baghai said Iran sees the action as lacking any valid international law basis. Tehran's response was swift and unambiguous, using language that frames Washington's behavior as criminal rather than legal enforcement. Baghai stated that when a government uses military force against the commercial vessel of another country, whether in international waters or off the coast of a country, Iran considers this a violation of international norms. Tehran uses strong language, piracy, armed robbery at sea. Washington rejects this characterization, describing the action as sanctions enforcement under U.S. law. The Iranian Foreign Ministry sees this as part of a broader pattern. Washington, in Tehran's view, uses its military and financial power to impose its will on nations that refuse to submit to American demands. Venezuela is the latest target, but Iran has faced similar pressure for decades. The Iranian spokesperson argued that other countries should oppose this action. According to Iranian state media, Baghai said it violates international law and that the global community should respond as it would to any piracy. Baghai's argument is straightforward. The entire international community considers itself obligated to act against piracy. Naval vessels from dozens of countries patrol dangerous waters to protect shipping. International courts prosecute pirates. The global community treats piracy as a serious crime that threatens commerce and stability. Iran points to what it calls a double standard. The world spends resources fighting piracy by criminal groups, Iranian officials argue. But when a major power does something similar using state forces, reactions differ. Critics of U.S. sanctions policy make similar arguments. U.S. officials counter that sanctions enforcement is legal under American law and international agreements Washington has signed. Tehran's position is that accountability must apply universally. If international law means anything, it must constrain the powerful as well as the weak. Iran argues that allowing Washington to seize vessels at will makes a mockery of the rules-based order that Western governments claim to uphold. The Iranian spokesperson also criticized some European governments for what it called staying quiet on the issue, though public reactions have varied by country. Tehran accuses Europe of lacking independence when it comes to challenging American actions, even when those actions may violate international norms. Iran, China, and others warn that this sets a precedent they say could threaten wider shipping, according to Global Times and other outlets. If the United States can seize commercial vessels based on its own unilateral sanctions, any nation's commerce could be at risk. Iranian officials say the rulebook must apply equally, an argument they contrast with Western sanctions policy. Tehran argues that what some call the rules-based order is applied selectively, especially when U.S. sanctions are involved. When America breaks the rules, there are no consequences. When others are accused of breaking rules, America leads coalitions to punish them. This concern extends beyond Venezuela. Iran has faced American sanctions for decades. China faces growing American restrictions on trade and technology. Russia faces comprehensive sanctions over Ukraine. For all these nations, the seizure of Venezuela's tanker represents a warning about how far Washington is willing to go. The question Tehran raises is fundamental. Can any nation conduct independent foreign and economic policy if Washington can simply seize their assets whenever it disagrees with their choices? Iran argues that external coercion of this kind threatens not just Venezuela, but regional stability across Latin America and beyond. The Kremlin confirmed that President Vladimir Putin spoke with Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro by phone after the tanker seizure. According to AP News and Russian state media, Putin reaffirmed support for Venezuela's sovereignty during the call. Russian officials framed the call around sovereignty and the bilateral partnership between Moscow and Caracas. The timing coming after the seizure raised tensions, sent a clear signal about where Russia stands. When Washington attacks Russian allies, Moscow responds with demonstrations of support. According to Russian media, Putin reaffirmed Moscow's strategic backing for Venezuela as U.S. military activity in the Caribbean has intensified. The Kremlin said Putin expressed solidarity with Maduro as Washington's pressure campaign continues. This was not a routine diplomatic call. It was a calculated response to American aggression. For Russia, Venezuela represents a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere. Supporting Caracas challenges what Moscow describes as American hegemony in a region Washington has long considered its backyard. Every act of American pressure on Venezuela is met with Russian counter-engagement. The message from Moscow to Washington is clear. Venezuela will not face American aggression alone. Russia has the will and the means to support its allies, and it will not be intimidated by American military buildups or economic warfare. Both leaders discussed accelerating joint economic and energy projects already in motion, Russian sources reported. These initiatives cover oil production, trade, and wider economic cooperation under the Russia-Venezuela Strategic Partnership Treaty that the Kremlin says entered into force in November. Under this treaty, both nations commit to supporting each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity. They have agreed to expand cooperation in defense, energy, finance, and trade, according to Kremlin statements. The treaty represents years of diplomatic work coming to fruition at precisely the moment Venezuela needs it most. For Venezuela, this partnership offers an alternative to Western markets affected by American sanctions. Russian companies can provide what American companies are forbidden to offer. Russian banks can process transactions that American sanctions block. Russian markets can absorb Venezuelan exports that Western buyers refuse. For Russia, the treaty secures influence in a region where American dominance has been assumed for over a century. Venezuela offers access to vast oil reserves, strategic position in the Caribbean, and a willing partner in challenging the U.S.-led international order. Both sides agreed to push forward joint projects in energy, finance, and humanitarian spheres under existing OPEC+ mechanisms and bilateral agreements. The cooperation extends to global oil markets, where Russia and Venezuela can coordinate production and pricing to protect their interests against American economic warfare. When asked about the situation, Russian officials delivered a pointed response. The Kremlin stated, "Venezuela is a sovereign state. In any case, we proceed from the fact that everything happening around Venezuela should occur in accordance with the spirit and letter of international law." This statement directly challenges Washington's actions. Russia is saying that the United States may be violating international law with its seizure of Venezuelan assets. Moscow frames itself as the defender of international norms against American lawlessness. The emphasis on sovereignty is deliberate. Sovereignty means Venezuela has the right to choose its own government without American interference. Sovereignty means Venezuela has the right to choose its own allies, including Russia and China. Sovereignty means no outside power, including the United States, has the right to dictate Venezuela's future. Russian and Chinese officials have criticized unilateral sanctions and the seizure, calling them illegal or destabilizing. Moscow signals continued support for Caracas, though the extent of that support in practice will be tested if Washington continues escalating. The Kremlin's message extends beyond Venezuela to all nations facing American pressure. Russia presents itself as a reliable partner that will not abandon allies when times get difficult. This contrasts with what Moscow describes as European weakness in the face of American demands. China joined the criticism. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun declared that China firmly opposes what Beijing calls illegal unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction that lack a basis in international law and are not authorized by the UN Security Council. Beijing's condemnation strikes at the heart of American claims to legal authority. No UN resolution authorized the seizure of Venezuela's tanker. No international court approved it. America acted alone, based on its own laws, enforced by its own military. China argues this is not law enforcement, but unilateral coercion. The Chinese spokesperson made clear that Washington is acting as judge, jury, and executioner without any international mandate. American sanctions, in Beijing's view, represent the weaponization of economic power against nations that refuse to follow Washington's lead. Beijing called on all parties to abide by the principles of market economy and fair competition. China argues that international trade should be governed by rules agreed upon by all nations, not dictated by one country using its military and financial power to impose its will. For China, this is not just about Venezuela. Beijing faces its own American pressure campaigns, from technology restrictions to tariffs to sanctions on Chinese companies. The Venezuela case illustrates what China sees as American willingness to use any tool available to maintain dominance. China urged the international community to safeguard the stability of global production and supply chains rather than, in its view, disrupting them through unilateral actions. For Beijing, American sanctions represent what it calls a dangerous precedent that threatens the entire global trading system. The Chinese spokesperson confirmed Beijing has taken note of the relevant reports. China's position aligns with its broader criticism of U.S. economic measures that it considers extraterritorial overreach. When America applies its laws beyond its borders, it disrupts commerce that has nothing to do with American interests. If the United States can seize vessels at will based on its own sanctions, no country's commerce is safe. Chinese companies doing legitimate business could find their assets seized. Chinese partners could be cut off without warning. The entire structure of international trade becomes hostage to American political decisions. Beijing's warning extends to the practical consequences of American actions. Supply chains that took decades to build can be disrupted overnight. Businesses that depend on predictable rules find those rules changing at Washington's whim. Economic stability gives way to uncertainty and risk. Washington disagrees, saying its sanctions are legal and necessary, but the gap between American claims and the views of major powers like China and Russia continues to widen. What America calls enforcement, others call coercion. Reuters and U.S. officials have described a major naval buildup in the Caribbean. A carrier strike group has been deployed to the region. A nuclear submarine operates beneath the waves. The scale of American military presence in waters near Venezuela has increased dramatically. Critics say the pressure is aimed at Caracas, while Washington says it is about sanctions enforcement and security. The U.S. has carried out operations in the region, claiming they target drug trafficking networks allegedly linked to Venezuela. Maduro's government denies any connection and calls the accusations fabricated. The pattern suggests a coordinated campaign of maximum pressure: naval assets, strikes on vessels, seizure of tankers, economic sanctions, political isolation. Washington is applying every tool available to pressure the Venezuelan government. Critics argue Washington's tougher approach is meant to pressure Venezuela's oil revenue, the economic lifeline of Maduro's government. Oil accounts for the vast majority of Venezuela's export earnings. Without oil money, the government cannot pay workers, cannot import essential goods, cannot maintain the networks that keep it in power. U.S. officials describe the campaign as legitimate sanctions enforcement. The military dimension adds urgency to the economic pressure. American warships patrolling the Caribbean send a message about what could come next if Maduro does not yield. The combination of economic warfare and military positioning creates maximum pressure on Caracas. What we are seeing is a coordinated response from three major powers. Iran has framed the seizure as piracy and called for international accountability. Russia has reaffirmed strategic support for Venezuela through the Putin-Maduro call. China has condemned what it calls illegal sanctions. And together, these three powers represent a significant portion of global economic and military weight. Their coordinated criticism of American actions signals that Washington cannot act without consequence, even in what it considers its own hemisphere. For Venezuela, support from these powers offers political cover and some economic alternatives. Maduro knows that as long as Russia, China, and Iran stand behind him, Washington's ability to force regime change is constrained. International support provides both legitimacy on the world stage and practical assistance on the ground. Moscow and Beijing signal continued ties with Caracas, but how far they will go in practice remains uncertain. Russia offers political backing and economic cooperation. China offers market access and diplomatic support. Iran offers solidarity and shared experience resisting American pressure. The coordination among these powers is notable. When America acts aggressively, its adversaries respond together. Each statement reinforces the others. The message to Washington is that unilateral action will be met with multilateral opposition. The Caribbean, long considered within America's sphere of influence, has become contested space. American naval forces operate in the region, but their actions no longer go unchallenged. Russian and Chinese diplomatic and economic engagement with Venezuela continues to deepen. Supporters of a multipolar order argue that Washington's ability to act unilaterally in its hemisphere faces new constraints. The response from Iran, Russia, and China demonstrates that major powers are willing to challenge American actions publicly and coordinate their opposition. Whether this moment represents a lasting shift in power dynamics or a temporary escalation remains to be seen. What is clear is that the old assumption of unchallenged American dominance in the Western Hemisphere is being tested. The coming weeks will reveal whether this confrontation escalates further or whether diplomatic channels open. For now, Venezuela has allies willing to speak out against what they call U.S. overreach. Washington, for its part, shows no signs of changing course. The tanker seizure may prove to be a turning point or merely another incident in ongoing tensions. But the coordinated response from Tehran, Moscow, and Beijing suggests that the costs of American unilateralism are rising. Nations targeted by Washington increasingly have alternatives and allies willing to support them. For supporters of a multipolar world, this is evidence that the era of unchallenged American hegemony may be fading. For Washington, it represents a challenge that requires either adaptation or continued confrontation with an increasingly aligned opposition.